back here to the YouTube channel US and Brazil Connection. So I'm gonna try to make a video here to respond to a very frequent question that I get from my friends here in the United States about what's going on with the political situation in Brazil. So um, we are close to the presidential elections, and we have elections now coming up in October this year. So just for the background, for your background, so Brazil has a pretty similar political system with the United States. Obviously, this is a little bit an oversimplification. I'm not going to talk too much into details here. I don't want to make a 2 hours video, but Brazil became a republic in 1889. Before that, so Brazil had a king. We had two kings right after the independence of the country. The independence of the country happened in 1820-22. So from 1820-22 to 1889, we had two kings in Brazil, and there was still a pretty much strong relationship with Portugal in the sense that those two kings, they were part of the Portuguese family that came to Brazil in the early 19th century. So this is the background before the Republic. In 1889, there was a military coup, and Brazil became a republic, a presidential republic. Basically, we had some moments of democracy, limited democracy in the earlier 20th century. We had a very important politician that was very populist, but he made for sure important advancement of the country in terms of developing the industry, developing social rights for the workers. The name of this politician is Getúlio Vargas. He was the president of Brazil from 1930 to 1945. He became, in a way, a dictator. In 1945, he left the power, and then he came back as a Democrat. He was elected by vote in 1950 and stayed until 1954, until his death. So, and I'm going to create additional videos to talk about that specific moment in the Brazilian history, which is a very important one. But since then, 1954, Brazil had some other presidents, and democracy system was starting to work in a way. Again, people had the right to vote and all of that. Then in 1964, there was a military coup in Brazil, another military coup. And the military stayed in power until 1985, so 21 years. Since 1985, let me just adjust here. Since 1985 up to today, Brazil has a democracy again. We have presidents, governors, mayors, all of those politicians. They are elected by direct vote. It's a presidential system like the United States. So we have a president. We do not have a prime minister. There are elections for president every 4 years, and since 1998, there's a possibility of one re-election only, one term only re-election. So basically, most important presidents we had so far, I could say two of them, in my opinion, are Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He was the president from 1995, January 1995 to January 2003. So he stayed 2 terms. He made important changes in Brazil in the sense of modernizing the economy, the state, creating some institutions that strengthen the democracy in Brazil, and also stabilizing the economy. So before Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Itamar Franco, who was a temporary president that stayed in Brazil from 1993 to 1994, actually 1992 to 1994, Brazil had a huge inflation, so it was something like 2,000% a year. And with Itamar Franco and Fernando Henrique and other economists, the economic situation was stabilized and the inflation went down to the first years 1995 1996 to 10% a year. Then it went down to something between 4 and 6% a year. Another very important president in the history of Brazil is Lula, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He was the president from 2003 up to January 2011, and then he also stayed 2 terms, 8 years, and then he transitioned the power to another president elected by his same group, his same political group, the same political party, which is called Partido dos Trabalhadores, is the Labor Party in Brazil. It's a left party, and the president elected at that time in January 2011 was Dilma Rousseff. Was the first woman to be the president of Brazil. She stayed 1 complete term. She stayed 4 years. She was re-elected, and then in the middle of the second term, she was impeached. So she left. The vice president took over the power. All of this process, it's important to explain because obviously there's many people that say, oh, it was a coup, it was not fair, and all the process, but she was impeached by the National Congress. So she was impeached based on the Constitution, and you can always argue there was corruption and what was the level of the corruption. Obviously there was corruption involved. You can look on the web, you can find all the news about that. There's ongoing discussion to which level she was involved in that, directly involved or not. There are some questions I think it's fair to ask about that. But the whole impeachment process was voted by the National Congress. So it was voted by the deputies, it was voted by the senators. And according to the Brazilian Constitution, in order to impeach the president, you need to have 2/3 of the National Congress voting against the president. So this happened, and she was really impeached. Obviously, there's people in Brazil today that thinks that this was a fair process, an honest process, and that she deserved to be impeached. And there's people in Brazil that thinks the opposite, that it was a coup and was unfair and it should not have happened. So this is an ongoing discussion in Brazil. I think it's fair to have this discussion since Brazil is a democracy. And now the vice president, Michel Temer, he stayed in power for about 2 years, and we are going to go into new presidential elections in 2018, now in October. And you have the situation about Lula, because Lula, who was a former president of Brazil, he stayed 2 terms, he stayed 8 years, as I said before. I'm sorry. So he wants to be candidate once again. He can do that according to the legislation. It's different from the United States, for example, where the president stays 2 terms and then he can never come back. In Brazil, the president can stay 2 terms, then he needs to live for at least 4 years. Then, yes, he or she is allowed to come back. So he has the right to come back if he wants to apply for president. But there's a complicated situation because he's in jail. He's in jail and he's leading the polls. He's leading the polls. Last week we just had a national poll. He has something like 37% of the total votes so far, which is very, very high. And it's fair in the sense that he did an important government for Brazil. You can always argue there was corruption involved as well, and there's several proofs of corruption in his government. But I can say the same for the other Brazilian presidents. I can say the same for Fernando Henrique Cardoso as well. Both presidents, in my opinion, they were extremely important to Brazil. Fernando Henrique more on the economy side, stabilizing the economy, modernizing the country. Lula more important in terms of social advancement and expanding social programs that were created by Fernando Henrique and giving social help to poor people in Brazil. So I think this is fair. It's fair to say that. Obviously, I think Brazil today, similar to other countries in the world, is living in a moment of the extreme. So probably many people who are watching this video, they're gonna say I don't agree with this guy and what is he talking about. I'm totally in favor of Lula, or I'm totally in favor of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, or I'm totally in favor of Dilma. So there's a big discussion today in Brazil about that. So it's very difficult to give you a kind of more moderated opinion about the country, because people tend to go to the extremes. Either one guy was everything he or she did was perfect and good, and the other one everything was terrible and bad. And I don't agree with that analysis. I think all the politicians and pretty much all the things in our lives, you have good things, you have bad things. So I think we need to recognize, although I have my own personal political preference, I do recognize that all of those politicians, they had important accomplishments for Brazil. Fernando Henrique and Lula. So the situation today is complex because of this, because Lula is leading the polls, but he's in jail. And there's, again, I'm going to give you my opinion, but mostly based on the facts. The facts are that Lula was put in jail because corruption that involved big companies in Brazil, companies that build roads and public constructions, such as infrastructure in general. And he received money from these companies in order to favor these companies to gain contracts with the government. There is, in particular, he is in jail now because one particular case of an apartment that he received from one particular company. So it's not a huge apartment, it's not a $30 million apartment, it's probably $1 or $2 million apartment. So that's the situation. There's many other investigations, ongoing investigations against Lula, saying that he has $100 million in Switzerland, in banks account in Switzerland, or even more than that. So this is ongoing investigations. I'm not going to say anything about that until they show the facts. But the facts are, for this particular matter, which is one apartment, there was a long process in Brazil that took approximately 18 months, and he was considered guilty by two instances of the Brazilian legal system. So by the Brazilian Supreme Court, and also by a secondary court, regional court in Brazil. So he was considered guilty for this particular crime, and he is sentenced to jail for 12 years. So that's the situation. Once again, you may argue, you have many people in Brazil that say this is fair, he should be in jail, and he committed several crimes. And there's also an ongoing narrative in Brazil that this was in fact a very minor crime that he committed. The biggest crime was try to take control of the country, and putting people from his political party in the power forever and ever, and in a way trying to destroy the democracy in Brazil. And even because of his political views, for example, if you look in Google, you're going to find that he always supported Cuba, he always supported Venezuela, he always supported Maduro, Hugo Chavez, and those type of politicians. So there's many people in Brazil that believe in that it was not only this crime itself, but the whole political view of Lula and his political party to try to transform Brazil in a type of Venezuela. This is one ongoing narrative that I think, in fact, is a strong narrative, and you have at least a big proportion of the Brazilian population that believes in that. And also you have a big proportion of the Brazilian population that thinks exactly the opposite, that is a kind of coup against Lula, and this coup is organized by the rich people in Brazil, or to some extent even by the people that doesn't want to have a popular person in the government or a Labour Party in the government, because these people, these rich people, they don't want to distribute the wealth of the country to the poor people. So this is another narrative, and it's a narrative that says that there's no proofs against Lula that he did not committed any acts of corruption. So those two narratives are ongoing. The country is divided. If you look at the last presidential elections in 2014, Dilma Rousseff, who was the president at that time and was re-elected with the support of Lula for a second term, she won the presidential elections with 51% of the votes. The other candidate that sustains the other narrative, and by the way, his name is Aécio Neves, and he's also involved with corruption in Brazil now. He's in big trouble in Brazil now. He got 49% of the votes. This was 4 years ago. So, in my opinion, the country continues to be divided. You have those two groups with different narratives. And I think for us, at least what I'm trying to do with this channel, probably some people will not like my approach, but I'm trying to show you both sides. I think we need to talk about both sides because that's my personal view. To some extent, both narratives make some sense. You know, I'm not saying that Lula is honest. I think he is corrupt and he is guilty. But you can also say the same for previous presidents of Brazil, for other politicians, and you can also argue that Lula, on one way, and his political party tried to fight against a democracy in Brazil, and even some things they want to do that they could not do, but they wanted to control the media and all those things. But also you can argue on the other side that Lula and his government was important for the poor people in terms of expanding some social programs, and some of those programs actually created by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, by the previous president. But he had for sure an important role in those social programs during his government, during Lula's government. So, and that's not a coincidence that he still has 37% of the votes in the polls, even being in jail. So that's a little bit of my perspective I wanted to share with you. Invite you to leave your comment here, to subscribe to my channel, US and Brazil Connections. I will expand even more this channel, and that's really the idea, to give you some flavor of what is Brazil and some tips if you want to visit Brazil, if you want to spend some time there, or if you want to learn more about the history of the country or the culture of the country. So welcome to this YouTube channel, and let's keep in touch.